And that is why there are over 500 lawsuits that have been filed by various entities, organizations, states to prevent this regime from its continuing lawlessness. So let me go. In fact, the courts require things like, how about evidence?
Welcome back to Freedom Forge, the channel where truth is forged in fire and facts matter. If you believe in strong borders, national sovereignty, and leaders who actually put their country first, go ahead and like this video and subscribe right now, because today we're breaking down a Senate hearing that reveals just how divided Washington is on immigration, law enforcement, and the role of federal power in this country. This hearing focused on immigration enforcement, federal funding, and whether the federal government should be able to tie money to local cooperation with immigration policies. Lawmakers debated whether conditioning federal grants on supporting immigration enforcement is constitutional, whether executive orders are being overused, and whether local law enforcement should be required to assist federal immigration authorities. At its core, this hearing is about control. Who decides how laws are enforced in America, and whether protecting the border is a priority or just a political talking point. Now let's get into it.
Last year, the Trump administration started trying to condition federal grants whether cities and counties support federal immigration enforcement. This is a question for Professor Vladeck. They tried conditioning FEMA emergency preparedness funding. They tried conditioning Department of Transportation infrastructure funding. This regime has a propensity to tie various kinds of funding to various ideological positions that this regime takes. And by the way, the regime keeps losing in court. Professor Vladeck, why does Trump keep losing in court and trying to withhold funding for these other very important programs that our communities rely upon?
Well, Senator, I think the short answer is because, as the Supreme Court has said for decades, there are 4 different conditions that federal spending conditions have to satisfy to be constitutional. And the conditions that the Trump administration has imposed have violated, Senator, somewhere between 2 and 3 of them, depending upon which condition we're talking about.
Name one condition that they've violated.
So, first of all, the conditions have to be clearly expressed in law. An executive order that interprets a statute to allow the president to impose a condition is not clearly expressing that condition in law. The condition has to be substantially related to the purpose of the funds, tying all of the state's transportation funding to whether it does or does not ban DEI practices is not related to transportation funding. And then the third category is some of the grant cancellations and some of the spending cancellations are seemingly First Amendment retaliation. So they run into the third problem.
Everyone should understand that executive orders, which is how this president wants to run the country, apparently, in addition to taking us into an undeclared, therefore illegal war, is by executive order. That is not law. And that is why there are over 500 lawsuits that have been filed by various entities, organizations, states to prevent this regime from its continuing lawlessness. So let me go. In fact, the courts require things like, how about evidence? Thank goodness the courts still require factual evidence in order for the courts to go along with this regime. Again, for Professor Vladeck. Local law enforcement already have a lot of important missions. They respond to mental health challenges, missing children, wildlife encounters. They perform welfare checks, direct traffic, provide first aid, and conduct search and rescue. They help the public during natural and man-made disasters. And right now, Hawaii law enforcement officers are helping our North Shore communities dig out from a massive flood. That is what local law enforcement does. Of course, that is all in addition to preventing and responding to crime and ensuring public safety. Professor Vladeck, local law enforcement, as I mentioned, does a lot of things. And for this, they require the trust of the community. So, in your view, are they also required by either federal law or the Constitution to enforce federal immigration law in order to everything that they already do on behalf of the community?
So they're not required to, Senator, and indeed I'm not sure they can be compelled to. But if I might briefly, I think that the relevant point is that different localities are going to have different priorities. And those priorities are going to vary based upon who the populace is based upon what happens in that locality. New York City and a small town in Montana are not going to have the same law enforcement priorities. And so part of what this constitutional structure recognizes, for better or for worse, and I'm not here to suggest that this is what I would have chosen if it were up to me, is that local governments are in a better position to make those calls. They're more accountable to their elected, to their populaces, and that the federal government doesn't have the power to tell local governments what their policy choices ought to be.
This is for Sheriff Burkett. Thank you. The president's obsession with deportations isn't making Americans safer. In fact, just look at what ICE is doing in Minnesota, in Chicago, and other places. And it is terrorizing communities and further eroding the relationship between immigrant communities and law enforcement. Sheriff Burkett, what is the importance of trust with local law enforcement, as long as we're talking about how important that is to enable local law enforcement to provide public safety?
Madam Senator, it is critically important that we secure and maintain that level of trust with our public. It's impossible for my deputies to do the job that we do day in and day out. As you already articulated, we do a number of things and we provide a number of services to the community. But when that trust is broken, then we are unable to provide services. We're unable to solve crimes as effectively as we would like to. And unfortunately, what we've seen play out over the past few months with ICE and CBP coming into our communities, it has eroded that trust and has dismantled our ability to be successful in combating crime.
And by the way, that trust takes time to build.
Yes, it does.
So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a Perspectives on Politics article entitled, quote, "How Interior Immigration Enforcement Affects Trust in Law Enforcement," end quote, which finds a significant decrease in trust of local public and police and sheriffs when they support federal immigration enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you. That'll conclude the hearing. Written questions for the record can be submitted until Wednesday, April 1st at 5 p.m. We ask the witnesses to submit their responses within 2 weeks. So by Wednesday, April.
Right away, what stood out in this hearing was the argument that the federal government should not be allowed to tie funding to immigration enforcement cooperation. The claim was that conditioning grants, whether it's FEMA funding or transportation money, on supporting federal immigration policy is somehow unconstitutional or coercive. Now, let's be honest about what that really means. What they're saying is that local governments should be able to receive federal money, taxpayer money, while refusing to cooperate with federal law enforcement. Think about that. The same federal government that is responsible for enforcing immigration laws is being told it can't expect cooperation from local jurisdictions, even when it's funding them. That doesn't sound like accountability. That sounds like selective enforcement. The testimony even argued that some of these policies violate constitutional limits on federal spending and could be considered retaliation under the First Amendment. But here's the problem with that argument. The federal government sets conditions on funding all the time. That's not new. That's how policy gets implemented across states. So the real issue here isn't whether conditions exist. It's whether people agree with the specific policy being enforced. And in this case, that policy is immigration enforcement. Then the hearing moved into another major point: executive authority. Critics claim that executive orders are being used too aggressively, calling them not law, and pointing to hundreds of lawsuits challenging these actions. Now here's my take. Executive orders are not new. Every president uses them. The difference is when one administration uses them for policies some people don't like, suddenly it becomes a constitutional crisis. That's not consistency. That's politics. If you want to debate policy, debate it. But don't pretend the tool itself is the problem when it's been used for decades by both sides. Now let's talk about local law enforcement, because this is where things get really interesting. The argument made during the hearing is that local police departments have too many responsibilities, everything from responding to emergencies to maintaining community trust, and that requiring them to assist with immigration enforcement could undermine that trust. And yes, local law enforcement does a lot. That's absolutely true. But here's the question nobody wants to ask directly. How do you maintain public safety if federal immigration laws are not being enforced at the local level? If someone is in the country illegally and commits a crime, should local law enforcement ignore that status? Or should there be coordination to ensure that laws are actually upheld? Because at the end of the day, laws only matter if they are enforced. The testimony also emphasized that local governments should have the freedom to set their own priorities based on their communities, suggesting that the federal government shouldn't dictate those decisions. Now that sounds reasonable on the surface. But immigration is not a local issue. It's a federal issue. Border control, national security, and who enters the country. Those are not decisions for individual cities or counties. Those are decisions for the nation as a whole. And when local governments refuse to cooperate, what you end up with is a patchwork system where laws are enforced in some places and ignored in others. That's not how a functioning country operates. Another major claim during the hearing was that increased immigration enforcement is actually eroding trust between communities and law enforcement, making it harder to fight crime. Now, let's take a step back. Trust is important, no doubt, but so is safety. And the idea that enforcing immigration laws automatically makes communities less safe is something that deserves serious scrutiny. Because if enforcing the law becomes optional based on perception, then we're no longer talking about law enforcement. We're talking about negotiation. And that's a dangerous path. What this hearing really showed is a fundamental divide in how leaders view the role of government. One side believes enforcement should be flexible, adapted to local priorities, and sometimes secondary to other concerns. The other side believes that laws, especially immigration laws, must be enforced consistently to protect the country and maintain order. And if you ask me, a nation without enforced borders is not a nation at all. This isn't about being anti-immigrant. It's about being pro-law. It's about having a system that is fair, consistent, and respected. Because when laws are selectively enforced, trust in the system doesn't increase, it collapses. At the end of the day, this hearing wasn't just about funding or executive orders. It was about whether the United States is willing to stand by its own laws or allow politics to dictate which ones matter. So the real question is this: should federal law be enforced equally across the country, or should local governments decide when and how to follow it? If you made it this far, you already know this is the kind of real, unfiltered breakdown you won't get from the mainstream media. So go ahead, like this video, subscribe to Freedom Forge, and stay informed, because the truth matters now more than ever. And here, we're going to keep bringing it to you straight.